"You weren't invited," my stepmother said. And she smiled when she said it. I was standing in the doorway of the Rideau Club, still in my good coat, the one I'd worn for every important occasion for the past 5 years. My bar admission, my first prosecution, and now this. The reception was already full behind her. I could see the canapes laid out on white linen, the flower arrangements my father would have found excessive, the circle of gray-suited men who had worked alongside him for 3 decades, men who had driven through a January ice storm to honor him. I had driven 4 hours on the 401 to be here. "This is family," my stepmother added, touching the pearls at her throat, "and close colleagues. You understand." She said it the way she always said difficult things, gently, like she was doing me a favor. Like turning a blade slowly was somehow kinder than just stabbing. Behind her, her son Fletcher appeared. He was in a charcoal suit that cost more than a junior crown's monthly salary, and he held a champagne flute the way people do when they want you to notice it. He leaned toward me, close enough that I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath, and he said the word, not loud. Never loud with Fletcher. He said it quietly, privately, just for me, a word that had no meaning except placement, that placed me firmly outside every door I had ever tried to walk through in that family. My father was a federal crown attorney. He spent 32 years prosecuting organized crime, financial fraud, and corruption for the Department of Justice Canada out of offices in Ottawa and Kingston. He was the kind of man who believed, completely and without apology, that the law was the one structure holding everything together when everything else gave way. He'd built his career on that belief. He gave me that belief too. I am Counsel Collier. I'm 31 years old. I'm a Crown Counsel at the Ottawa Regional Office of the Department of Justice. And on the morning my father was buried, I stood in the doorway of the Rideau Club and felt the precise, deliberate public weight of being unwelcome at my own family's memorial. I didn't answer Fletcher. I'd learned early that men like him only need a reaction, any reaction, to feel like they've won. I kept my face the way I keep it in a courtroom when opposing counsel tries to rattle me, and I walked back out into the cold. Those of you who haven't met a stepmother like mine might think I'm being dramatic. You might think no reasonable adult behaves that way at a funeral. I'm here to tell you, you haven't met Constance. She came into our lives when I was 19, 2 months into my first year at the University of Ottawa. Polished in the specific way that signals effort rather than ease, every gesture considered. She treated me with warmth so thin you could see through it, and my father, who spent 3 decades identifying liars in courtrooms, somehow couldn't see it in his own kitchen. I learned the shape of her cruelty slowly across years, one small incident at a time. The first was Christmas in my 2nd year of law school. I'd survived a brutal round of finals and made the 5-hour drive to the house in Kingston, on the water, and I was looking forward to nothing more complicated than my father's terrible puns and a real meal. I had my own key. I let myself in. The house smelled of pine and something baking. There was a note on the kitchen counter in Constance's neat handwriting. "Arden, we've gone to Fletcher's for the evening. Didn't want to interrupt your studies with the fuss. There's leftover soup in the fridge. Merry Christmas. C." I sat at the kitchen table and ate cold soup by myself in a house full of Christmas decorations I hadn't helped put up. I was 23 years old and I told myself it was an oversight. I wanted to believe people were basically decent, even when everything in front of me suggested otherwise. The second time I stopped being able to explain it away was after I passed my bar examinations. I'd done it on the first attempt. The kind of thing you tell your family with your hand shaking because you'd worked 3 years for it. I called my father and he said in his careful way, "Good." I expected no less, which from him was pure love. The celebration dinner, I found out later, had been at a restaurant in Toronto's Distillery District. A photo on Fletcher's social media, my father and Constance and Fletcher's wife, all dressed up, glasses raised. When I asked about it, my father paused too long. "Constance thought you might be too tired after the licensing ceremony. She didn't want to impose." He said it carefully, the way a man says something he knows isn't true but has agreed to say anyway. I stored it away. You do that, I think, when you love someone who is slowly being moved away from you by someone else. You keep records, you look for the pattern, you hope you're reading it wrong. I wasn't reading it wrong. The last time I spoke to my father was 12 days before he died. We were on a video call. He was at his desk in Kingston, and the autumn maples were turning outside the window behind him. He looked older than I expected, and there was a kind of fatigue in his eyes that was different from tired. He leaned toward the camera and said, "Arden, there are things I need to tell you. About Bain, I have files that—" And then Constance was in the frame, her hand on his shoulder, her smile already in place. "Still at it, you two?" she said brightly. "Come on, darling, our guests are arriving." She reached across him and ended the call. I stared at my screen for a very long time after that. The envelope found me just before Constance finished blocking me from the reception. An older man, slight, careful posture, the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades paying close attention in rooms with high stakes, pressed it into my hand without preamble. He had worked alongside my father at the department for 20 years before his retirement. "Your father asked me to give you this," he said, low enough that no one else could hear. He said, if he ever went quiet, it was for you. He walked away before I could respond. I sat in my car in the parking garage beneath the Rideau Club and held the envelope. Cream-colored paper, my name in my father's handwriting, a dark red wax seal pressed with his signet ring. Inside a small matte black USB drive and a folded slip of paper with 4 words. "Find Ruth, she knows." It took me 3 days to find her. Ruth had spent 26 years as a forensic accountant with the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. She was the kind of investigator who could read a corporate ledger the way a doctor reads a scan, every irregularity, every place where someone had tried to look ordinary and failed. She'd retired abruptly 5 years ago. No announcement, no farewell, she'd simply stopped appearing. I found her through a chain of former colleagues, a post office box in Chelsea, Quebec, and finally a conversation with a retired RCMP inspector who gave me directions instead of an address. "Turn left at the second logging road past the Gatineau Park sign. You'll know it when you see the satellite dish." The drive into the Gatineau Hills in January is not reassuring. The road's narrow, the trees press in close. The snow goes from plowed to packed to untouched, and at a certain point you start to genuinely question your judgment. The cabin sat in a hollow between 2 ridges, built to disappear, dark timber, low roofline. But as I walked the last quarter-kilometer on foot, I noticed the details. Motion sensors on the trees, a camera mounted on an oak angled down the drive, a Starlink terminal on the roof, incongruous against the gray January sky. She opened the door before I knocked. Late 50s, sharp eyes, a rifle held loosely at her side, with the practiced ease of someone who didn't need to raise it to make a point. "You're Jonathan's daughter," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "He said you'd come." She stepped back. "He also said you'd come alone." I held up the USB drive. Something in her expression shifted, not relief, exactly. Something grimmer than that. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." The interior of the cabin was, in its way, extraordinary. What read as a seasonal hunting property from outside was a working intelligence operation inside. Servers humming in a back room, a wall of monitors, cables running in organized bundles. The air smelled of coffee and ozone and careful isolation. She slid the USB into a terminal without ceremony and entered authentication codes from memory. A file directory appeared. Then she walked me through it the way a good analyst does, methodically, without drama, with specifics. Clifford Bain was a senior litigation partner at one of Bay Street's oldest firms. He sat on the Law Society of Ontario's Discipline Committee. He was photographed at charity events. He sponsored a first-generation law student scholarship. He was, by every visible measure, a pillar of the Canadian legal profession. He was also, according to the files my father had reconstructed over 18 months, running a laundering operation through a network of real estate holding companies registered across Ontario and the Cayman Islands. Client trust accounts used as pass-throughs, the kind of scheme sustained by patience and institutional access, and the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough. My father had looked closely enough. He had pulled the thread carefully, documenting everything, over a year and a half. And 6 weeks before a scheduled appearance before a Senate committee on legal ethics reform, where he had planned to present what he'd found, he died of a sudden cardiac event. At 63, no prior history of heart disease. There's an audio file, Ruth said, after she finished laying it out. He hid it in a standard departmental briefing recording, steganography, hidden in the background frequencies. Most people would never have found it. She isolated it, cleaned it, pressed play. The voice was flat and certain, the voice of a man completely unaccustomed to consequences. He's been talking to the committee. Make sure that conversation doesn't happen. Ruth ran it against a database she had no official right to possess. The match probability climbed to 98.3%. Clifford Bain. I sat back in the wooden chair and looked at the monitor. Everything I had stored away across years, the cold soup, the dinner I hadn't been invited to, the call that ended before my father could finish his sentence, resolved into something I could finally name. Not grief, exactly. Something harder than grief. My father hadn't just died, he'd been stopped, because he'd gotten too close and someone had decided that was unacceptable, and he had known they were coming. He had built this entire trail knowing they were coming, and he had built it specifically, precisely, for me. Keep digging, I said. My voice sounded different to me, quieter. Ruth nodded. She went back to work. I won't pretend I handled the next step perfectly. Anger wants to move fast. Ruth steadied me. A single audio clip dropped publicly gets buried in 48 hours, she said. You need an audience that already knows what they're hearing. The Canadian legal community is small and has long memories. There are networks, private email lists, invitation-only forums that existed before social media and persisted after because lawyers, as a profession, trust what they control. There is one in particular for active and retired Crown Counsel, federal judges, and legal academics, where information circulated that couldn't go in departmental memos. My father had been one of its founding members. I had his login credentials in the file he'd left me. We uploaded 40 seconds of audio, Bain's voice, clean and clear, no context, no identification. One line of text. Anyone recognize this? Within 2 hours, the thread had over 300 responses. A retired federal judge. I've been in a courtroom with this voice. I'm certain of it. A Law Society investigator. Running spectrographic analysis will update. And then, that evening, Bain's firm issued a formal statement through their communications director. I read it to Ruth on my phone. They were calling it a deep fake, a fabricated audio file, maliciously constructed to defame a distinguished career. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, not what I'd expected from her. They just confirmed it was him, she said. They denied the technology and identified the voice. They've told everyone on that forum exactly who they were listening to. The system came for me 4 days later. A meeting with my supervising director. Airless room, blinds half drawn. The kind of space designed to make you feel like you've already done something wrong before anyone says a word. Administrative leave, pending a conduct review. Unauthorized disclosure, breach of professional obligations, conduct unbecoming. They took my building pass on the way out. That same week, Fletcher appeared on a Bay Street legal commentary podcast. He spoke about me in a voice carefully calibrated to sound concerned. He described me as struggling with grief, unable to accept reality, fixated. He used that word twice. I sat in the furnished rental suite I'd moved into on Elgin Street and listened to it all and understood, with complete clarity, what they were doing. The strategy was old and simple and effective. You don't attack the evidence. You attack the person who found it. You make the messenger the story. You make her seem so unstable that everything she says becomes suspect. Have you ever had that done to you? Had someone take the truest thing you know about yourself, your competence, your record, your integrity, and reframe it as a symptom? It's a particular kind of violence, quiet and precise, and the worst part is that it works, sometimes, in the dark when you're alone. You start asking yourself, maybe they're right. Maybe this is grief. Maybe my judgment is broken and I just can't see it. I sat with that for one long night. Then I picked up my phone and called Ruth. The USB was still locked. I'd tried everything, case file numbers, my father's departmental ID, dates, names of major cases he'd prosecuted. Nothing. It won't be technical, Ruth had said. He knew you. He'd have chosen something only you would try. I sat with it for a long time. My father and I had a ritual. Every phone call, without exception, ended the same way. I'd say goodbye and he'd say, every single time, his voice the same no matter how brief the call, "Stay true, Arden." It was an instruction and a blessing at once. The thing a parent gives you when they know the world is going to push back hard, and they want you to have something to hold on to when it does. I typed it into the password field exactly as he said it, no spaces, all lowercase. "Stay true, Arden." The drive unlocked. There was a video file, dated 3 months before his death. He was at his desk in Kingston, the October maples behind him already turning. He looked tired. He also looked exactly like himself, precise, contained, the way he always was when he had something important to say. "Arden, if you're watching this, it means I didn't get to tell you in person. I'm sorry for that. Don't spend too long being sorry for me. I've had a full life and I knew what I was walking into." He paused. "I want you to know that I see the work you do and the reasons you do it. I should have told you that more often. You are exactly the lawyer I tried to teach you to become." I pressed my hand over my mouth. "Don't trust the formal process on this. The investigation needs to go outside the system. Everything you need is on that drive. Trust Ruth. Trust your own judgment. It has always been better than you think." When he spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter. Not a crown attorney anymore, just my father. "Stay true, Arden. I'll be watching to see how this ends." The Canadian Bar Association's annual General Conference is held every February. That year it was in Toronto, at the Fairmont Royal York on Front Street, the kind of room where the marble floors alone communicate institutional weight. Every senior lawyer in the country attends, federal and provincial judges, law society benchers, national firm partners, the Department of Justice Directorate. The people who run the legal profession in this country gathered in one place. Clifford Bain was a scheduled panelist on day 2. Topic: Legal ethics reform in the federal system. The irony was almost too precise to be accidental. I walked in through the main entrance in my navy wool suit, the one I wear when I need to remind myself I belong somewhere. I had the audio file on a tablet. I had a copy of every document Ruth had preserved, transmitted securely to the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement Team and the Department of Justice Inspector General at 9 o'clock that morning. I had timed everything to the hour. Constance saw me first. Her face did something complicated, a flash of something real beneath the surface management. Fletcher was beside her, talking to someone from a Bay Street firm. He stopped talking when he noticed me. Bain was across the room, working the crowd with the fluid confidence of a man who has never genuinely been held accountable for anything. He glanced at me, registered nothing, dismissed me. That was his mistake. The session opened with the CBA president's welcome remarks. I waited until the formal introductions were winding down, and then I stood up. They teach you in law school to build a record, to be clear, precise, to say exactly what you mean in the right order. "I apologize for the interruption," I said. The room went quiet in stages, first the people nearby, then outward in a wave. "My name is Counsel Collier. I'm a Crown Counsel with the Department of Justice Canada, Ottawa Regional Office. I'm also the daughter of Jonathan Collier, Chief Crown Attorney, retired, whose memorial some of you attended 3 weeks ago." Complete silence. My father died before he could speak to the Senate Committee on Legal Ethics Reform. I'm here so that the information he carried doesn't disappear with him. I pressed play. The voice came through the room's sound system with the clarity Ruth had engineered. "He's been talking to the committee. Make sure that conversation doesn't happen." The silence that followed was the kind I'd only felt in courtrooms at the moment before a verdict. I looked at Bain. The color was leaving his face. The smile was gone. He looked for what I suspected was the first time in a very long career, like a man who understood that what he had done was visible. "The complete evidentiary file," I said, including financial records, correspondence, and authenticated voice analysis, was delivered to the RCMP and the Justice Inspector General this morning. Several of the investigators are present in this building. The doors at the back opened. 4 plainclothes RCMP officers came through. They moved without looking left or right, direct and unhurried, straight to where Benjamin was standing. One of them spoke to him quietly. He didn't argue. He looked like a man who had run out of options and knew it. The handcuffs closed. The room stayed absolutely still as they led him out. I sat down. The weeks after weren't dramatic. That's what they don't tell you about justice. It's mostly paperwork, mostly process, mostly slow and careful and unglamorous. There were depositions, audits, reviews. The RCMP's investigation of Bain's firm eventually uncovered 2 decades of material. The will my father had signed 6 months before his death was examined by a handwriting specialist and a legal documents expert. What they found took 3 weeks to formally confirm. The original will, drafted 11 years earlier and deposited with a Kingston notary, left his estate. The house on the lake, the Rideau cottage we'd had since I was 7, his father's watch, his library, to me. My conduct review was closed. My building pass was returned. My director sent a formal letter of apology, which I accepted without saying what I wanted to say. Fletcher was named in the fraud proceedings as a secondary beneficiary of a forged estate document. His position on Bay Street did not survive the year. Constance sold the Kingston house and relocated somewhere I didn't need to know about. I went back to Ottawa. I went back to work. That spring, the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law asked me to speak at convocation. I stood at the podium in Tabaret Hall, looking out at 500 new lawyers in black gowns, and I thought about my father standing somewhere in this same building 20 years ago, watching me graduate. I set aside the prepared remarks. They will teach you here about procedure and precedent, I said, about burden of proof and statutory interpretation. They will teach you how to argue and how to research and how to read a contract until it tells you what you need to find. I paused. What they cannot teach you is this. The law only holds when someone inside it refuses to let it be turned against itself. When someone decides that their oath means more than their position, that the truth is worth more than the comfort of staying quiet. Your job is not just to be skilled. Your job is to be someone the truth can find when it has nowhere else to go. The applause when I finished was not polite. It was the kind that surprises you, full and sustained, the sound of people recognizing something they had needed to hear. Afterward, in the lobby, a young woman stopped me. Second year, she said, public law stream. She was holding her convocation program with both hands. Could you sign this? She asked. I want to send it to my mum. She always said the law was for other people, not for people like us. I looked at her for a moment, the quality of her nervous hope, the way she was standing, braced a little, as if she was used to being disappointed. I took the pen she offered. Tell your mum, I said, that someone like us just changed the outcome. I signed my name. For the first time in a very long time, I felt something I could only call peace, not the absence of grief, but something that had grown alongside it. The understanding that my father had trusted the right person with the last thing he had to give, and that I had not let him down.